It began not with a bang, but with a flicker. On a night like any other, inside an arena humming with the familiar energy of thousands, the rhythm of the show suddenly stuttered. The colossal screens that hung above the ring, usually a source of brilliant light and bombastic graphics, blinked. Just for a second. A digital hiccup. Most people didn't even notice, lost in the drama unfolding on the canvas below. But then it happened again. A longer, more deliberate darkness. The audio feed crackled, a sound like dry leaves skittering across pavement, and a low hum replaced the commentators' voices. It was the kind of technical difficulty that felt different, not accidental. The crowd's unified roar dissolved into a murmur of confused individual voices. You could feel the shift in the air, a collective holding of breath. The bright, predictable world of sports entertainment had developed a crack. Through that crack, an unnerving silence began to seep in. The wrestlers in the ring paused, looking towards the production truck, their rehearsed animosity forgotten. The referee shielded his eyes, searching for a cue that wasn't coming. This wasn't part of the script. This was an anomaly, a foreign element introduced into a controlled environment. And then, from unseen vents near the rafters, it began to pour. Not pyro smoke, with its celebratory scent of sulfur and spectacle. This was different. It was thick, white, and odorless. It descended like a fog, swallowing the lights, erasing the top rows of the audience, and slowly, deliberately, blanketing the ring in an impenetrable haze. The world was being erased. No one knew what was happening. The crowd stood frozen, a sea of upturned faces staring into the growing abyss. The murmur of confusion had turned into a tense, anxious silence. Security guards along the barricade exchanged nervous glances, their radios chirping with questions no one could answer. The fog was now so dense it had completely obscured the ring, turning the entire arena floor into a swirling white void. It felt like watching a memory fade in real time. Then, a shadow moved through the haze. It was just a flicker at first, a distortion in the smoke too quick to be certain. But then it moved again, closer this time. A silhouette, unmistakable in its coiled, predatory posture. It was a shape that had been absent for years, a form many believed they would never see in this arena again. A single thought, impossible and electric, began to ripple through the stands. It couldn't be. Could it? The silence was absolute now, a heavy blanket of anticipation. And then, boom. The opening chord of a song ripped through the speakers, a raw, serrated guitar riff that was both a memory and a threat. The roof of the arena didn't just explode with noise, it felt like it was physically torn off its foundations. Through the smoke, he emerged, not with a smile or a wave, but with a cold, hard stare. Dean Ambrose had returned, unpredictable, untamed, and more dangerous than ever. SmackDown will never be the same again. The sound wasn't just in the arena, it was everywhere, in living rooms, sports bars, and on tiny phone screens across the globe. The world stopped for a single shared gasp. For those watching at home, the experience was almost more surreal. Their feed had flickered, the screen filled with the same disorienting smoke, the commentators falling silent. They were sharing in the confusion, leaning closer to their screens, wondering if their broadcast had failed. And then, that music hit. That face appeared, and the internet broke. Social media platforms became a waterfall of pure, unadulterated emotion. It wasn't about analysis or ratings. It was a torrent of raw feeling. People posted videos of their reactions, screams of disbelief, tears streaming down their faces, friends grabbing each other in joyful shock. The name Dean Ambrose wasn't just a trending topic. It was a global monolith, eclipsing world news and celebrity gossip in a matter of seconds. For a generation of fans, this was more than the return of a favorite wrestler. It was the return of a feeling, the feeling that anything could happen. In a world of carefully curated stories and predictable outcomes, his reappearance was a lightning strike of genuine chaos. It reminded them of why they fell in love with this world in the first place. The magic wasn't in the moves. It was in the moments you could never see coming. And for the first time in a long, long time, nobody had any idea what was going to happen next. While the world celebrated, a very different kind of energy was crackling through the narrow hallways and crowded locker rooms backstage. The moment his music hit, the monitors in the gorilla position, where the show's producers direct the chaos, became the center of the universe. Jaws were on the floor. Headsets were filled with frantic, overlapping questions. Who cleared this? Does anyone know about this? Is this real? But there were no answers. The usual architects of the spectacle were as much a part of the audience as everyone else. Further down the hall, the reaction was more personal. Wrestlers, mid-conversation or stretching for their own matches, froze. For some, it was a ghost story come to life. His old friends, the men he'd gone to war with, felt a complicated warmth, a mix of excitement and a deep, sinking feeling of dread. They knew what he brought with him, a storm that would inevitably pull them all into its vortex. For his old rivals, it was something else entirely. It was the return of a problem they thought they had solved. The current champion, a man who had built his reign on order and dominance, was seen staring at a monitor, his expression unreadable. He wasn't watching a returning legend. He was watching a demolition expert who had just been handed the keys to the kingdom he had worked so tirelessly to build. The whispers started immediately, a paranoid currency of speculation. Was he back for good? Who did he have his eyes on? And the most terrifying question of all, who knew he was coming? Why does a man who escaped the machine willingly walk back into its gears? The question hung in the air long after the smoke had cleared. Dean Ambrose hadn't just left. He had vanished. He'd traded the roar of the crowd for the quiet of a life lived on his own terms. He had shed the persona, or so everyone thought. But his return wasn't a comeback tour. It wasn't about nostalgia or a final paycheck. You could see it in his eyes, in the unnerving stillness that had replaced his old frenetic energy. He looked like a man haunted, not by failure, but by a mission left unfinished. The legacy of a man like Ambrose is a complicated tapestry. He was the chaotic soul of a generation, the one who never quite fit the corporate mold. He was the one who spoke truth to power, even when it cost him. But in leaving, he had created a vacuum. The system he fought against had smoothed over his rough edges, replacing his unpredictable nature with a more polished, predictable product. His return felt like an immune response, a rogue cell reappearing to attack the sickness of sterility. He wasn't just Dean Ambrose, the wrestler. He was the physical embodiment of an idea, that true passion cannot be tamed, packaged, or controlled. And by walking back through that curtain, he was making a silent promise to every fan who felt disillusioned, a promise that the asylum was back under new management. And this time, he wasn't just here to rattle the cages, he was here to break them open. Hours later, the arena was empty. The last of the production trucks had rumbled out into the night. The lingering scent of smoke had been replaced by the sterile smell of cleaning products. In a small, unmarked room deep in the building's guts, a solitary figure sat on a metal folding chair. The leather jacket was off, thrown over a nearby equipment case. The wildness in his eyes had receded, replaced by a profound weariness. This was the part no one ever saw, the come-down. The adrenaline fades, and the reality of the choice he'd made begins to settle in. His phone, which had been off all day, lay dark on the table beside him. He knew what would be on it. Hundreds of messages from numbers he recognized, and many he didn't. But he only thought of one person, his wife. A woman who understood the language of this violent world better than anyone. She knew the character, the lunatic fringe, was a necessary evil. A suit of armor he had to put on to survive in that jungle. But she also knew the man who wore it. She knew the cost, She knew that to become that man again, he had to reopen old wounds, revisit dark corners of his mind he had tried so hard to lock away. This return wasn't just a professional decision. It was a personal sacrifice, a choice to let the storm back into their quiet life. In the echoing silence of the empty arena, he wasn't a returning hero. He was just a man, bracing himself for the war he had just voluntarily declared on the world and on himself. By sunrise the next morning, the wrestling world was a chaotic ecosystem of speculation. News outlets, podcasts, and talk shows were ablaze. But the most frantic conversations were happening behind closed doors, in conference rooms with polished mahogany tables. The men in expensive suits, the shareholders and network executives, were in a state of controlled panic. Dean Ambrose was not their kind of asset. He was a force of nature, a variable they couldn't plot on a spreadsheet. His value was undeniable. The ratings spike, the merchandise sales, the global buzz were all proof of that. But so was his danger. They had spent years building a brand of polished, reliable superstars. Athletes who understood their roles, who delivered their lines, who represented the company with a corporate-approved smile. Ambrose was the antithesis of that. He was a lit match in a fireworks factory. How do you script a man who refuses to read the script? How do you market chaos? Their immediate strategy was clear. Try to absorb him. They would offer him a championship match, a headline spot, a golden cage disguised as a throne. They would try to point his destructive energy in a profitable direction, aiming him at a designated corporate villain, but they all knew, deep down, that it was a fool's errand. You can't put a leash on a wolf and ask it to behave like a show dog. They hadn't just gotten a popular superstar back. They had willingly let an invasive species into their carefully curated garden, and they had no idea how to stop it from tearing up the roots of everything they had built. Far away from the corporate boardrooms, one man felt the weight of Ambrose's return more acutely than anyone else: the current world champion. He was everything the company wanted in a modern star: charismatic, physically perfect, and reliably excellent. He had climbed the ladder the right way, shaking hands, doing press, and delivering five-star matches on command. He had earned his place at the top of the mountain through discipline and dedication. He was the face of the era, and in one night his entire world had been destabilized. He watched the clip of Ambrose's return over and over, not with the awe of a fan, but with the cold, analytical eye of a king studying his usurper. He saw past the smoke and the crowd's roar. He saw the look in Ambrose's eyes, a chilling emptiness, a complete disregard for the rules of the game. This wasn't a challenger who wanted his title. A title was a symbol of order, of being the best within the system. Ambrose didn't want to be the best in the system. He wanted to break the system. The champion realized the terrifying truth. His championship belt made him the ultimate symbol of that system. It wasn't a prize to be won. It was a target. Every interview he did, every poster he was on, every match he had would now be viewed through the lens of Ambrose's shadow. He was no longer just the champion. He was the marked man, the final boss in a game whose rules had just been set on fire. The ripple effect of that night traveled in unexpected directions, touching people far from the main event spotlight. In a locker room filled with younger talent, the next generation of hopefuls, the mood was strange. While some were buzzing with excitement, one rookie sat by himself, staring into his gym bag, replaying the moment in his head. This young man had grown up with posters of Dean Ambrose on his wall. He'd studied his interviews, mimicked his mannerisms, and dreamed of one day being just as untamed, just as real. He saw Ambrose not as a performer, but as a revolutionary. But seeing him now, in the flesh, was different. The man who came through that smoke wasn't the scrappy underdog hero he remembered. This version was colder, harder, more isolated. There was a finality in his gaze that was deeply unsettling. The young wrestler realized a sobering truth. He had romanticized the idea of chaos. but he had never truly understood its cost. He saw in Ambrose a man who had burned every bridge, not out of recklessness, but with surgical precision. A man who had embraced the abyss so fully that he could no longer connect with the world he was supposedly fighting for. The rookie's admiration was suddenly tainted with fear. He was afraid of him, but he was also afraid for him. The dream of being the next Dean Ambrose died that night, replaced by a chilling understanding. Some paths, once you walk them, don't have a way back. You don't just play chaos. Eventually, chaos plays you. Weeks turned into months, and the legend of that night only grew. It was dissected, analyzed, and mythologized as the greatest surprise return in history. The official story, cobbled together by the company, was that a disgruntled production-level employee, a fan of Ambrose, had initiated the glitch as a rogue act, allowing the star to make his dramatic entrance. It was a neat, tidy explanation that preserved the illusion of spontaneity while reinforcing corporate control. But the truth was infinitely more unsettling. Years later, a retired sound technician would anonymously leak the real story. There was no glitch. There was no rogue employee. The entire sequence of events, the flickering lights, the audio cut, the specific density and deployment of the smoke, had been meticulously planned. It had been orchestrated through a series of anonymous encrypted messages sent to a handful of key technical staff, along with untraceable payments. The plan was a masterpiece of psychological warfare designed to create a sense of genuine system failure, to make the impossible feel real. And the architect of it all was Dean Ambrose himself. His return wasn't a surprise he capitalized on. It was an invasion he commanded. He hadn't just walked back into the arena. He had hacked its very foundations, turning the tools of corporate spectacle against themselves. And that's the final chilling realization. He didn't come back for the fans, or for a championship, or even for revenge. He came back to prove a point, that in a world of manufactured moments, the only person you can truly trust is the one who is willing to burn it all down. The smoke wasn't just cover, it was a message. It was a mirror, showing the entire system that its greatest illusion was its belief that it was ever truly in control.